On the very last day of World War II, a 19-year-old Mustang pilot was strafing an airfield in Japan. The night before the mission, he leaned over to his captain and said, "If I go, Captain, I'm not coming back." He was offered to be grounded by a doctor, but he refused because he knew someone else would have to fly in his place. After strafing that airfield, the order came to head back to base. All the Mustangs came into formation, and this kid gave a thumbs up to his captain just before they entered a cloud bank. That was the last time he would be seen. But before we get into that story, if you love military history like I do, I'm sure you'd want to hear the most turbulent highlights of the P-51 Mustang story, because there are quite a few. Now, to understand why the Mustang became what it became, you've got to start with what the United States actually had in fighter inventory when the war in Europe started in September of 1939. And the answer is almost embarrassing. American fighter design had lagged behind European development through the 1930s, partly because the United States wasn't expecting to fight a major war, and partly because the whole doctrinal obsession of the Army Air Corps was strategic bombing, not air-to-air combat. So they had the Seversky P-35, which was already being phased out. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk, still sitting in frontline American squadrons, was obsolescent. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, which was this innovative design with the engine mounted behind the pilot and a cannon firing through the propeller hub, had been crippled by the Army's decision to delete its turbo supercharger. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine, twin-boom design, was promising but still had its development problems to solve. And the only American single-engine fighter in real quantity production was the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. It was a decent low-altitude fighter, but simply not in the same class as the latest Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the Supermarine Spitfire. And this whole situation was made worse by the fact that the US War Department gave almost all turbo superchargers to heavy bombers. You know, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. Now, to quickly explain what that is, the turbo supercharger is the device that lets a piston engine keep its power up high, above 20,000 feet, where the air is thinner on oxygen. So you've got to force more air into the engine to get the same power as you would at lower altitude. Fighters were seen mostly as short-range interceptors, and nobody really expected enemy bombers to come flying over the United States, so there was no reason to give fighters that kind of high-altitude capability. The P-38 Lightning got those turbo superchargers, but it was the exception. So this whole situation left American fighters, already semi-obsolete, with just a single-stage, single-speed supercharger, which gave them useful performance up to about 15,000 feet. And the problem is, air combat over Europe was being fought between 20 and 30,000 feet most of the time. And this is the situation in the United States when the British Purchasing Commission arrived to buy fighters. They had their own trouble, losing Hurricanes and Spitfires faster than British factories could replace them, and they had the idea to use American production capacity to help them out. They looked at the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, which the British called the Tomahawk, and they saw it as the best available option. But the American production was already running at full capacity, so there was no room to spare any for the British. So then the British went to North American Aviation, and instead of making them P-40s, which were already becoming pretty much obsolete, this company suggested, "Why don't we build you a better fighter around this same Allison engine?" And they promised they could do this in no more time than it would take to prepare the factory for P-40 production, which meant a brand new fighter ready and flying in, listen to this, 120 days. Now, this is an extremely short time to come up with and then put into mass production something that doesn't yet exist. But they went ahead anyway. And if we get into how exactly they pulled it off, this would be a 3-hour video, but in short, they worked non-stop every single day through 78,000 man-hours of engineering labor. And after 102 days into that deadline, the prototype was ready, with the designation XP-51. It was still without an engine, guns, and even paint, but they'd made it. A few days later, it got prepared for the test flight, and that's when things got interesting. Because the prototype almost killed the test pilot and the entire program, when the engine for some reason just died and the thing crashed and flipped in a plowed field. The pilot actually walked away, but the prototype had to be rebuilt. Anyway, through further trial and error, the British still wanted the plane and continued the contract. And eventually, to not bother you with all of it, it went into production under that well-known name, the P-51 Mustang. Now, the first thing that'd make the Mustang famous is the airframe, because the Mustang was given what's called a laminar flow airfoil. A traditional wing has its thickest point close to the leading edge, and the airflow becomes turbulent across most of the wing's surface. A laminar flow wing moves the thickest point back toward the middle of the wing chord, which keeps the airflow smooth, and smooth air produces less drag. The Mustang was the first production fighter in the world with this design. The second critical decision was where to put the radiator. Because liquid-cooled engines run hot, and they need a big radiator to shed that heat. And a big radiator sitting in the airstream creates a lot of drag. So every fighter designer had this problem. But the Mustang team made an unusual choice and put the radiator in the fuselage behind the pilot, which was then fed by an air scoop under the belly, several feet back from the intake. And the reason this mattered is because of this phenomenon called the Meredith effect. The thing is that air comes into the scoop and gets compressed because the scoop narrows. Then that compressed air passes through the radiator where it absorbs heat from the engine coolant, which makes it expand. And then the expanding heated air exits through an adjustable flap at the back of the duct. And because it leaves faster than it enters, it actually produces a small amount of forward thrust, kind of like a very weak jet engine. Engineers still argue to this day whether the Mustang actually generated positive thrust or just reduced cooling drag to near zero. But what it did do was cancel out most of the drag penalty that a normal radiator installation would cost. In everyday language, the Mustang was getting its engine cooling almost for free, aerodynamically speaking. So combine that with the laminar wing, the flush riveting, the fuselage shape that was one of the first ever mathematically lofted, and the aluminum alloy skin, and what you've got is an unusually clean airframe. This is why the early Mustang, despite using the exact same Allison engine as the P-40, was some 30 miles per hour faster at altitudes up to 15,000 feet. Initial armament was 430 and 250 caliber machine guns. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because the Mustang was still running that very same single-stage, single-speed mechanical supercharger. Power peaked around 12,000 feet and dropped away sharply above 15,000 feet. So the Mustang, for all of its beautiful airframe, couldn't go where the combat was routinely happening in the skies over Europe. So, the first operational use of Mustangs was low-level tactical reconnaissance, flying from bases in England out over German-occupied France, making fighter sweeps at rooftop height. The first aerial victory actually came during the Dieppe raid, when a Mustang shot down a Focke-Wulf 190. There were some versions used as dive bombers too, but it all seemed like this was pretty much it for the Mustang, because it simply couldn't go where it was needed the most. And that was high in the air, escorting and protecting the heavy bombers that were getting decimated by fighters deep over German territory in Europe. And then something happened that'd change everything. Because one day, a test pilot from Rolls Royce got the chance to try out the Mustang and give his opinion on it. And when he landed after half an hour, he knew exactly what this fighter needed. He was convinced that putting the Merlin 61 into the Mustang, which was the improved engine that had just unlocked the Spitfire's full potential, would be an absolutely perfect match with that revolutionary airframe. Now, this was a two-stage, two-speed, intercooled supercharged version, and it kept making serious power all the way up to 30,000 feet, exactly where the Mustang desperately needed to be. Problem was, this engine was in demand and in short supply, because it was going into already proven Spitfires and British heavy bombers, and nobody was thrilled about diverting any of it to an experimental conversion on an American airframe that the Americans themselves weren't particularly excited about. But he convinced them to try, and within just 48 hours, the Mustang had a Merlin bolted into it. The conversion also got a chin radiator under the nose to handle the bigger supercharger's heavier cooling demand. And when it went up for the test flight, it just blew everyone out of their minds. The absolute ceiling was now 40,000 feet. Top speed was 433 miles per hour, which is 100 miles per hour more than the Allison version. The cleanest airframe in the war was now married to the best piston engine the Allies had. What more can a man ask for? Remember that situation with the American fighters I told you about at the beginning? Well, when they saw what the Mustang they weren't interested in did with the new engine, they suddenly became very interested. They ordered 400 of them, based purely on performance calculated on paper, and then another 2,200 when they saw it fly. One thing led to another, and the P-51D was ready and adopted by the US Air Force, now with that bubble canopy that gave the pilot an unobstructed 360-degree view, which was a massive advantage in dogfighting, and of course that American signature armament for fighters, 650 caliber machine guns in the wings. Now, before we get into the Pacific, and the mission where the last American combat death of World War II would happen under mysterious conditions, You've just got to see what the Mustang did in Europe once it appeared in this configuration. Because the idea of heavy strategic bombers defending themselves against German fighter interceptors had fallen apart very quickly in 1943. The bombers were getting butchered, and the only real protection for them would have been fighter escort. But here's another problem. The main American escort fighter at the time was the P-47 Thunderbolt, and it wasn't a bad fighter, but it had one big problem: range. The bombers could go far and deep over enemy territory, and the fighters could not. So the fighters protected them for only a portion of the mission, then turned around and went home. And the Germans just waited until the escorts peeled off and then swarmed the bombers with everything they had. And the results were, as you can expect, catastrophic. Entire bomber missions got ripped apart this way. If only the Allies had a fighter with an efficient airframe paired with the best fighter engine of the time. Well, they had one, although almost completely by sheer coincidence. However, there was still one missing link. Listen to this. The Mustang had 184 gallons of fuel in the wing tanks, plus in the later version another 85 gallons added in the fuselage behind the pilot. And this gave it a fuel load that nothing else in its class could match. Now you might say, well, the Thunderbolt carried 370 gallons of fuel, which is more than the Mustang. And on paper, sure, but in practice, no, because the Mustang got far more miles per gallon than anything else flying at the time. On internal fuel alone, the D version could fly for some 1,100 miles, while the Thunderbolt could make about 800. But before you say, well, that's not much of a difference, here's what changed the situation completely, and perhaps even the outcome of the war: drop tanks. And the weird thing is, the concept was there long before the war. It had just been overlooked for some weird reason. So the idea is this: if you build a fighter with enormous internal fuel tanks, you get an aircraft that can fly a long way but fights badly when it gets there. If you build a fighter with small internal tanks, you get something that fights beautifully but can't reach the target, which was the situation the Allies were stuck in. But if the aircraft could carry extra fuel externally, and if that extra fuel could be dumped the moment the pilot needed to fight, then you could have both things at once. That's the drop tank, this teardrop-shaped thing, attached by mechanical shackles and electrical release mechanisms. The pilot controls which tank he's drawing from, so he burns the external fuel first through the whole outbound leg of the mission, while his internal tanks stay completely full. And then, when the drop tanks are spent, or the moment enemy fighters are spotted, the pilot just pulls the lever, jettisons the external tanks, and immediately he's got a fast, nimble fighter ready for dogfighting. The drop tanks most commonly used on Mustangs over Europe were actually made of compressed paper impregnated with plastic resin, which made them cheap to make and useless to the enemy. Now, there's a catch with all this extra fuel though. That 85-gallon fuselage tank I mentioned earlier was the source of the single worst handling problem on the mission. When it was full, the weight of all that fuel sat behind the pilot and shifted the Mustang's center of gravity so far back that it became genuinely dangerous to fly. It was tail-heavy on takeoff, so every pilot on every mission spent the first part of the flight deliberately burning as much fuel out of that tank as possible, keeping only the wing tanks for fighting and hopefully the return leg home. By the end of 1943, the Merlin Mustang was arriving in England in numbers. The Mustang typically carried a pair of 108-gallon drop tanks, and they pushed the combat radius to some 750 miles. Which now meant they could fly all the way to Berlin, fight there and get back to England, while strafing targets of opportunity on the way home, which was the other big thing. Because now the Mustangs, besides solving the problem of bombers getting decimated, started terrorizing the Luftwaffe on the ground, strafing their fighters parked on airfields, shooting up fuel trucks, shooting up anything that looked German and moved. And this brought complete air superiority by the end of the war. Mustangs were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in Europe alone, more than any other American fighter in the theater. But the real deal for Mustang pilots, and where the story you heard about at the beginning actually takes place, was only just about to begin: the Pacific. So here's the situation. The Americans had B-29 Superfortress bombers based in the Mariana Islands, and they were trying to reach the Japanese home islands to destroy the same kind of industrial targets that had been bombed in Germany. Except the distance from the Marianas to Tokyo was roughly 1,500 miles one way, 3,000 miles round trip. That's about 2.5 times the distance from England to Berlin, and it was well beyond the reach of any single-engine fighter in the world, including the Mustang. So the B-29s were flying those missions without escort, and they were being hunted by Japanese fighters the same way the B-17s had been hunted over Germany. I mean, in the same way, not in the same amount, but still the problem was the same. And here's what made it worse. because between the Marianas and Japan, there was nothing but an empty ocean the whole way. So a pilot whose engine quit halfway to the target had nowhere to go but into the water. And the search areas were so vast that a man floating in his little yellow vest was very unlikely to ever be found. You see where I'm going with this? So the only way to put Mustangs within striking range of Japan was to find a forward airbase somewhere closer to the target. And roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo sat this small volcanic island. You might know it better as Iwo Jima. From there, a Mustang with drop tanks could reach Japan and come back, barely. But somebody had to take it from the Japanese first, cause they held it with some 21,000 men, fortified and not willing to give up easily. They used Iwo Jima to radio warnings up to Japan whenever bomber formations flew past, and occasionally launched small air raids from it against the Marianas. But, in American hands, the island would silence the radar, eliminate the interceptor field, give damaged B-29s a place to land in an emergency rather than ditching in the ocean. And most importantly, it had finally let the Mustang escort the bombers the last 700 miles into Japan. The cost of taking that island was catastrophic, as you probably know. Some 7,000 American Marines dead, 20,000 more wounded, while out of 21,000 Japanese defenders, only about 200 were captured alive. And the question of whether the island was even worth that price has never really gone away. Because by the time Iwo was in American hands, the B-29 campaign against Japan had already shifted from daylight precision bombing to nighttime incendiary raids on Japanese cities. And night raids didn't need fighter escort. Plus, the Japanese air defense force was visibly collapsing anyway. Only about 10 pure bomber escort missions like those in Europe were ever flown from Iwo Jima. And these escort missions were completely different than anything seen while bombing Germany. Flying 1,500 miles round trip over open ocean in a single-engine fighter to escort bombers over the Japanese home islands was called a Very Long-Range Mission, or VLR. And it was a type of operation that had not existed prior to 1945, since neither aircraft nor military doctrine had ever been required to carry out anything like it. The first American fighter pilots flew in from Hawaii and the Marianas and landed on Iwo Jima on the 6th and 7th of March 1945, while the battle was still being fought at the northern end of the island. And what these men found when they climbed down from their cockpits was one of the most horrific battle aftermaths you could imagine. Bodies, burned out equipment, the smell, all of it still there. No need to explain it more than that, you'd agree. A little over 2 weeks after they arrived on the pre-dawn morning of the 26th of March, which was the same day the island was officially declared secure, some 300 Japanese soldiers came out of tunnels during the night and infiltrated American lines in complete silence. They attacked the pilots' camp right next to the middle airfield, just as 8 fighter pilots were walking to the flight line at dawn. What followed was a 5-hour close-quarters battle on an airfield with shocked fighter pilots fighting for their lives. All the attacking Japanese were soon killed or captured, but Fighter Command alone lost 44 men and had about 100 wounded. However, they continued with what they came there to do, and the next day, the 21st Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, strafing one of the smaller Japanese-held islands just north of Iwo. And the pilots themselves, by the standards of the mission that was waiting for them, were shockingly inexperienced. Squadron and flight commanders had around 1,500 hours of total flight time, mostly in other aircraft types, but their time in the Mustang itself averaged only about 20 hours, and the younger pilots who'd fly as wingmen had an average of fewer than 300 hours of total flying time, and for many of them, only 5 to 10 hours on the P-51 before arriving on Iwo. These guys were about to be asked to fly the longest, most demanding single-engine combat mission anyone had ever attempted, and half of them barely knew where the landing gear lever was. There was nothing between Iwo Jima and Japan. A pilot who lost his engine halfway out or halfway back had no emergency field to glide to, just the ocean. Each flight took 7 to 8 hours of sitting 120% focused in a cramped cockpit, with a small relief tube for a bathroom. So you can choose whether you'd rather be thirsty or have to use the toilet, which is much easier said than done in this configuration. Fighter Command had to set up a routine of hot baths and massages for the pilots coming back from missions cramped up and just physically and mentally wrecked. It was normal for the pilot to not be able to get out of the cockpit by himself, as he literally wasn't feeling half of his body. Then there's the navigation problem. The Mustang had basic cockpit instruments like a compass, a radio, and so on, but these were nowhere near enough to find a 4x2 mile island 750 miles across a featureless ocean. So, each VLR mission was led by pairs of B-29 Superfortresses, whose navigators took the fighters all the way up to the Japanese coast, where the bombers would circle offshore while the Mustangs went inland to do their job, and then pick them up again on the return leg and lead them back to Iwo. There was the radio system that let each Mustang find his Superfortress navigator, the homing system nicknamed Uncle Dog. When the Mustang pilot was off course to the left of the signal source, he heard the Morse letter D, hence dog, repeating in his headset. When he was off course to the right, now he heard the Morse letter U, which meant uncle. When he was dead on course, both signals merged into a single steady hum. It was the single most important piece of equipment for Mustang pilots, but for a lot of them, it wasn't enough. If a pilot for any reason got separated from his formation over the Pacific, he was on his own, and being on your own out there meant dead. The fuel situation was worse. To squeeze 1,500 miles out of a Mustang, each aircraft carried those drop tanks, which got even bigger for the Pacific, up to 165 gallons, and the Merlin engine had to run for hours on end at around 2,000 revolutions per minute and a lean mixture, operating just above the point where it had cut out in order to conserve the fuel. Because of this, the spark plugs lead-fouled from the low power and had to be replaced after every mission. And on top of that, the volcanic grit from Iwo sand got sucked into the intakes on takeoff and then wore the engines out faster. So, engine aborts were routine, not rare, routine. And if the engine did fail, a Mustang pilot's options over open water were really bad. Because the P-51 had a ducted radiator scoop on its belly, and hitting the water on a ditching attempt tended to flip the aircraft, and you can then imagine what happened to the pilot inside. So, the standing instruction was never to ditch a Mustang in water. If the engine quit, the pilot's only option was to climb out and bail if he had enough altitude to deploy his parachute. Air-sea rescue was organized for exactly that, but good luck finding one little pilot in a vast ocean. A lot of pilots who bailed out were never seen again. The overwhelming majority of pilots being lost on VLR missions weren't being shot down by the Japanese. They were being killed by the mission itself. In the 6 weeks between the 1st of July and the 15th of August, 1945, 85 American fighter pilots were killed on VLR missions, and only a small handful of those deaths came from the enemy action. On the 1st of June 1945, for example, 148 Mustangs went up to escort a massive incendiary raid, and they flew straight into horrible weather. Extreme turbulence, rain, and snow put down 27 Mustangs, with only 2 pilots being rescued. And that was in a single day, with no enemy action whatsoever. By August of 1945, the 3 Mustang groups had lost 160 aircraft and had around 90 pilots killed, with about 50 more pulled out of the sea by air-sea rescue. And then, at the beginning of August, the atmosphere on the island changed. 2 atomic bombs were dropped, and every man on Iwo expected the war to end within hours. Except, the missions were still being briefed, and the missions were still being flown. On the evening of the 13th of August, 1945, with no surrender yet received, 7th Fighter Command briefed one more VLR mission for the following morning. And what the pilots in that briefing didn't know was that the mission they were about to fly would turn out to be the last combat mission of the Second World War, and that one of them wasn't coming back. Among the pilots in that briefing was a 19-year-old second lieutenant from Brooklyn named Philip Schlamberg. And here's the thing about this kid. He'd scored the highest IQ ever recorded on an Army Air Corps entrance exam. A result like that let him pick his own assignment, and of all the things he could have picked, he picked fighter pilot. His squadron commander was Captain Jerome Yellin, who was 21 years old and who'd been on Iwo since the first Mustangs arrived back in March. Both men were Jewish. From neighboring states, they shared a tent, and Yellin had basically taken Schlamberg under his wing. And what they were being sent to do on the morning of the 14th of August, 1945, was just an ordinary VLR mission. Escort B-29s up to Japan, strafe an airfield somewhere in the Tokyo area, and come home. Nothing unusual. Except, everyone on the island expected the war to be over at any moment. That evening, Schlamberg leaned over to Yellin and said, "If I go, Captain, I'm not coming back." Yellin asked him what he was talking about, and Schlamberg said, "It's this feeling I have." Yellin was concerned enough that he took it up afterwards with his commanding officer, who gave him an offer he could pass along. If Schlamberg would just go see the flight surgeon, the doctor could ground him from the mission, and another pilot would just take his place. So Yellin brought the offer back to the tent, but Schlamberg refused. He said he wouldn't let another man fly in his place. So the takeoff, the strafing run, and the return all happened during daylight, on what was in local time and in US records the 14th of August, 1945. But here's where the timing gets strange. because in Japan, the attack itself was roughly at noon on the 15th of August Japan time. It coincided with, or followed shortly after, Emperor Hirohito's announcement of surrender. So what this means is, by the time those Mustangs were strafing their target, the war was in its final minutes, or had technically just ended. So Yellin led a full-plane flight of Mustangs that morning, and Schlamberg flew as his wingman. A code word had been arranged, so if Japan surrendered while they were in the air, American bombers and picket ships would relay that code word to the flight, which meant abort the mission and come home. So, they cruised above the Pacific under the morning sun, rendezvoused with their superfortress navigators offshore, flew to Japan, where they strafed an airfield under heavy anti-aircraft fire. The standing rule on these missions was once any pilot in the flight reported his remaining fuel had dropped to 90 gallons, the whole flight had to break off. And when one of the pilots called out 90 gallons, which was the minimum fuel they needed to make it back to Iwo Jima, Yellin gave the order to pull up and head home. So he checked his own gauges, and he looked over to his right at Schlamberg flying tight formation on his wing, and he flashed him a thumbs up, and Schlamberg returned the thumbs up. However, Yellin didn't know that this was the last time he'd see Schlamberg. Yellin led the flight up into a bank of clouds above the Japanese coast. He came out the other side, and Schlamberg was gone. No radio call, no smoke trail, no parachute in the air behind him, no wreckage visible below. Nobody heard anything, nobody saw anything, he was just gone. Yellin's flight was too short on fuel to mount a prolonged search at this point. So they banked south and began the 3-hour flight back to Iwo, still hoping that Schlamberg had just been separated in the clouds and would come out somewhere. And when Yellin's 3 remaining Mustangs touched down on Iwo Jima, they were told that the war had been over for 3 hours. But Schlamberg didn't turn up. No radio call came in on any frequency. No other aircraft reported sighting him. The Navy and the Air Sea Rescue Network along the route reported nothing. His Mustang and his remains were never recovered. His status was eventually changed from missing in action to killed in action. And because his body was never recovered, he's memorialized on the Wall of the Missing. Philip Schlamberg was the last American pilot lost in combat in the Second World War, and no one to this day knows what exactly happened to him.